actually, this title is just slightly changed from what was in the prior publicity. I've changed it to narrating the fly instead of teleporting the fly, media systems and the self-referential scientist. It's a little bit more explicit that I'm going to be taking a kind of narratological approach to looking at what's going on with the images of science and scientists in these films. And so I think I've eliminated most of the narratological jargon, although I will use this term diegesis a couple of times, and a really excellent non-jargony synonym is story world, just the landscape of a particular narrative language. Okay, there's now a string of fabulations called The Fly, the 1957 short story by George Langelaan, and this was published in Playboy, 1957, then republished in the Playboy book of science fiction and fantasy. 1958 movie directed by Kurt Neumann and David Cronenberg's 1986 remake. Each version of The Fly centers on a singular scientist's lone obsession with the creation of a teleporter. Now, in Langelaan's original prose version, the teleporter is literally a kind of matter telephone. The sending and receiving ends of the device are re-engineered telephone call boxes. And the main complication of each fly results when the inventor of the teleporter, who's named André Delambre in the 50s versions and Seth Brundle in Cronenberg's version, the main complication of each fly results when the inventor of the teleporter pilots the device by transmitting himself across space. He sends the message of himself to himself. But unfortunately, the message gets garbled in transmission due to an unforeseen increment of noise in the signal, and he comes out of the receiver an insectoid monster. Now, The Fly updates a perennial narrative mythos of bodily metamorphosis by wiring the transformations, the transformative complications of a metamorphic narrative directly to communications technology. The scientist's metamorphosis by a communications medium is brought about by his own metamorphosis of a communications medium. Moreover, each version of The Fly embeds the paradoxical machinery of telematic metamorphosis within embedded narrative frames. This mediation of the metamorphic body through stories within stories is a form of literary self-reference. As Todorov has said, putting one story within another calls attention to storytelling per se. The forms of narrative self-reference in the telling of The Fly, I will argue, reframe the story told about the metamorphosis of a self-referential scientist. All right, to begin with, Neumann's cinematic fly preserves the embedded structure of George Langelaan's textual original. In both of these 50s versions, the story of André's catastrophe is narrated by his wife, Helene, in explanation of her role in his partial obliteration by industrial steam press. Langelaan's Helene produces a written account embedded within a frame narrative produced by André's brother, while Neumann's Helene offers an oral account realized cinematically as an extended flashback embedded within the main cinematic diegesis. Lacking the textual markers of literary prose to indicate this shift in narrative level, the movie uses a standard pair of visual brackets, those classic wavy lines that relay narrative agency across the ether from one diegesis or story world to another. So here's the opening bracket of Helene's narrative.
This is not a confession. Although I killed my husband, I'm not a murderess. I simply carried out his last wish. A few months ago...
How'd you pick out some of your own signs?
Andre, what a pleasant surprise.
He's been down down in the basement lab a whole lot recently. And here's the closing bracket. In the 50s versions, the doubling of narrative agencies, the up and down shift into and out of Helen's explanation, is tidy and discreet, and this stability at the borders of the narrative frame resonates with the style of Andre's metamorphosis, which is also, while gruesome, as we'll see in a second, but nevertheless tidy and discreet. Mistakenly teleported together, Andre and the fly swap heads and one arm apiece. And from that moment, there are two Andres, a fly-headed man and a man-headed fly. This doubling occurs along the two-sided border of the teleporter, a detail already articulated in Langelaan's text when Helene recalls there, quote, "It was only after the accident that I discovered Andre had duplicated all his switches inside the disintegration booth so that he could try it out on himself." In other words, as a self-contained technological framework embedded within already embedded narrative frames, the teleporter, this vehicle of transport, feeds back into the narrative self-reference of the tale that narrates it. The mediated duplications of the fly play off the initially unitary status of the scientist who suffers the metamorphosis. The traditional figure of the scientist, I would say, occupies a mode of modern selfhood, paradoxically purified of otherness by objectivity, that is, by the supposed elimination of self-reference from his or her observations of objects and other subjects. In the flies of the 50s, for instance, the scientist Andre Langelaan comes forward as a brilliant, hopeful benefactor meriting our regard and his wife's absolute devotion. The disaster about to happen, which will dash all his hopes, will be all the more catastrophic for destroying such a man. In this scene I'm about to show from Neumann's film, Andre unveils his teleporter to Helene, allays her incredulity, and then rhapsodizes over its world-transforming potential.
It's the same one. Have you turned magician?
In a way. For a split second, an infinitesimal part of a second, this was disintegrated. One little moment it no longer existed. Only atoms traveling through space at the speed of light. Then here, a moment later, integrated again into the shape of an ashtray.
Oh, you're joking.
Doesn't sound possible, does it? But it is true.
It is impossible. You're playing some joke on me.
But take television, what happens? A stream of electrons, or sound and picture impulses, are transmitted through wires of the air. The TV camera is the disintegrator. Your set unscrambles or integrates the electrons back into pictures and sound.
Yes, but this is different.
Why?
Oh, because it's impossible.
50 years ago, if my father were told he could sit in Montreal and watch a World Series in New York at the exact time it was happening, he'd say it was impossible. This is the same principle exactly.
But it's not the same. This is solid.
No, it's not. To your touch, maybe it is. But in reality, it's billions of atoms, which we believe are only a series of electrical impulses.
But you actually did this? It's no trick?
No. I can transport matter, anything, at the speed of light perfectly. Of course, this is only a crude beginning. But I've been lucky enough to stumble on the most important discovery since man sawed off the end of a tree trunk and found the wheel. The disintegrator-integrator will completely change life as we know it. Think what it'll mean. Food, anything, even humans will go through one of these devices. No need for cars or railways or airplanes, even spaceships. We'll just set up matter-transmitting receiving stations throughout the world and later the universe. There'll never be a need of famine, Surpluses can be sent instantaneously at almost no cost anywhere. Humanity need never want or fear again. I'm a very fortunate man.
I'm a very fortunate
Such heroic images of the scientist further embellish, I would say, the non-self-reference of the proper scientist as selflessness altogether, or altruism, universal benevolence, the generosity of bestowing gifts freely upon humanity, the magnanimity of lifting old burdens off the race with his discoveries and inventions. So to sum up so far, the formula for scientific propriety retailed here in the 50s flies is the production of objectivity through the elimination of self-reference. One might see this as parallel to the media ideal of immediacy. A standard goal of communications engineering is the elimination of noise and other distortions or errors from transmitted signals. Nevertheless, noise can never be entirely eliminated. Random fluctuations and Brownian flutters inhabit the very matter out of which communications media are constructed. In other words, noise is a marker of material self-reference in the midst of other referential, supposedly dematerialized messages. Noise is a self-referential effect asserting the indispensability of the material medium carrying the signal to its destination. Moreover, noise is information itself. Noise is precisely unexpected information, like the fly, an uncanny increment that rolls the dice of randomness within every communicative transmission. In mechanical systems, noise is the feedback of operations, but in autopoietic systems, self-referential operations accommodate and bind the noise of mediations, the materialities of metabolism, perception, and communication within the boundaries of the given system, and as a result, systems adapt, evolve, or grow more complex. However, on the face of it, every version of the fly replenishes the myth of objectivity as the elimination of self-reference by exposing the dire consequences when the properly other-referential, natural referential scientist takes himself as the object of his own observations and as the subject of his own apparatus, thus becoming literally self-referential. As we've noted, though the narrative medium of this tale is already self-referential in that the story of Andre is a story told entirely by Helene, a second-order story framed by a first-order diegesis. But at the climax of Helene's narrative, self-reference turns into daemonic aberration right at the moment of total revelation to her, when she finally gets to see the entirety of Andre's transformation, and in Neumann's film, she becomes herself the object of his now insectoid gaze. The scene I'm about to show takes place after Helene begs Andre to transport himself one more time in hopes that the machine will somehow undo what it has done. She hasn't seen him yet under the veil. My volume. Is the sound done? No, there's sound. Nope. But you can't hear the dial. Noise in the signal. Well, who needs dialogue? Well, let's hope the sound comes back. Well, okay. This scene I want to comment is doubly transgressive in that the momentary fusion of the cameras with the fly's eye implodes Helen's diegetic agency, her narrative agency, from within, giving us the realization of a fly's eye view she could never have seen, and leading to a virtual lapse in her ability to witness and thus narrate these events at all. Nevertheless, the pseudo-diegesis of the cinema apparatus covers that over, continuing to narrate from somewhere beyond the frame constituted by the brackets that demarcate Helen's character-bound narration. So in this twice-given moment of narrative transcendence, the eye of the fly becomes the cinema eye, and vice versa. The framing is two-sided. The cinema itself turns into a fly, the eye of the fly fusing focalization and narration into the cinema's overwhelming power of seeing and duplicating the scene. This monstrous equation reveals the metamorphic and many-eyed nature of film itself as a medium. This is perhaps the main message of the media mythos of Neumann's version of the fly. In the 1950s flies, the fly head and arm of the scientist emerge full-blown. Within days, Andre feels his mind going, and with Helen's help, he does away with himself before the mental mutation into something inhuman is complete. Now, in quite stark contrast, Cronenberg's fly draws out the story time of both the bodily and the psychic transformations, letting weeks elapse while the new post-human creature, the Brundle fly, reaches phenotypic and psychic expression from its creation through genetic merger in the teleporter. The 80s version front-loads the self-transmission of the scientist to clear narrative space for the pseudo-evolution of the Brundle fly. Transposing the tale from the nuclear family to the single scene, Cronenberg forgoes the familial pieties and narrative formalities of the prior versions. This version takes far less time to get down and dirty. But while Cronenberg's telling of the fly lacks the ostensible narrative embedding of the 50s versions, there's a wealth of cinematic embedding and a new level of explicitness about the demon of self-reference. And here I'll track some of the devices that bring this forward in Cronenberg's film. The movie opens with shy scientist Seth coaxing intrepid science journalist Ronnie, back to his pad, a laboratory set in an urban loft, furtively hoping, it seems, to seduce her with his telepods. To demonstrate them, he asks her for a personal article